Hi, everybody. I just wanted to welcome you and thank you for zooming into my oral defense. I plan to take about 30 minutes to get through the slides, and that will leave plenty of time for questions in the end. With my dissertation, when I first started exploring it and thinking of ideas on what to study, I was very much intrigued by exploring what I experienced in practice as an occupational therapy. In particular, this disconnect I felt between the theory of occupational therapy, or what I've been taught in occupational therapy, what it is, what it's about, versus the reality of practice or modern practice, the demands of the modern practice. For those of you who aren't familiar with occupational therapy, we're very much occupation or activity focused. We feel somebody's health is determined by their ability to engage in activities that are meaningful or enjoyable to them. Health is about doing the things you love to do, basically. We also very much believe in theory about egalitarian care. So it's very much client-driven versus therapist-driven, very much client-centered. It's very much empathic or empathy-focused, in the sense that we really believe, in theory, that everybody is an individual, a complex occupational being in which they have all these different interests and needs around occupation and activity. And it's our job as therapists to understand everyone and see what is meaningful and important to them, and to design a treatment plan that kind of meets their particular needs. That is kind of the ideal theory of OT. The reality of occupational therapy, especially if you talk to the patients or review the literature on what patients are saying in surveys, you kind of see that OT isn't doing what it thinks it's doing, or what it believes it should be doing. There's very much a lack of egalitarian care. In that sense, it is not, patients are saying it's not patient-driven, it's therapist-driven. They say there's a lack of empathy, lack of understanding, very much a narrowing of occupational options, especially within rehab facilities. They just don't have the choices to do the things that are important to them, which is a huge part of what OT is in theory. And they very much felt like the therapists were institution-focused, reimbursement-driven, they weren't really the priority. It was more about doing what they need to do to get paid by insurances. A lot of the causes behind this can be laid at just the demands, the nature of modern healthcare. The HMO kind of era is still very much dominates healthcare. By that I mean productivity focused, reimbursement focused, discharge kind of focused. The results of all this is a lot of burnout amongst therapists, a lot of dissatisfaction amongst therapists, kind of like what I was feeling, a lot of patient dissatisfaction, reduced quality of care, more medically based care, more norm-based assessment. Everything is kind of based on the neurotypical individual, and anything below that, kind of that norm, that scale, is where you're going to get reimbursed. It's not individually focused, it's more like group norm focused. And like I said, very much focused on the needs of the institution to get that reimbursement to kind of stay viable and to survive economically. And that means seeing lots of patients and quickly getting rid of those patients and discharging them and getting on to more patients. And doing what you need to do documentation-wise to get paid, to get reimbursed. So thinking, okay, this is the issues that I sense, is definitely there, patients are sensing it, and there's definitely seems to be an incongruence, lost values and sense in OT. What is a potential solution? It's a very complex, multi-layered problem. There really is no one solution. But I felt like empathy, or return to empathy as an OT profession, this individualized care, maybe this is the way to go kind of go back to our roots in a sense. This may tackle or begin to tackle this kind of growing disconnect. So when I'm looking at empathy, I find a lot of evidence, a lot of emerging literature around empathy in healthcare, showing that it improves outcomes. The more empathic the clinicians are, the better the patients seem to do. It seems to actually reduce visits, reduce medical errors, which very much fits the financial reimbursement needs of modern healthcare, improves patient satisfaction. It's definitely more client-centered. If done the right way, actually reduces clinician burnout. And it's the big drawback, criticism against it is like, oh, you're spending all this time trying to understand the patient. There is no time into healthcare. But actually, they found that you can do this really quickly. You can do this really timely and efficient kind of way. Like I was saying, it actually saves you money in the long run because you're reducing those errors, reducing those visits. You kind of get it right the first time. It also very much felt like it fit what occupational therapy is about, how occupational therapy should ideally be done, in theory, as we kind of went back to those espoused values. A great example of this is this idea of narrative reasoning. Narrative reasoning, first kind of established by Bruner, and then kind of tailored to OT by Mattingly and Fleming in their work in the early 1990s. Mattingly is an anthropologist, and in their study what they did is they kind of embedded themselves within a OT rehab facility in Boston, I believe it was. And what they found in their study was that the therapists, or the OTs that were very skilled and effective with their patients, saw their patients not as a list of problems or a list of medical problems or a below the norm kind of situation, but as an individual story, a unique story with a beginning, middle, and potential future story. And while this was dated and definitely was a different kind of world back then in the 1990s, there's been studies that have revisited this, showed its worth in modern healthcare. Even Mattingly has revisited this in some of her work. And again, I think this really fits what OT is about. So all this kind of seemed to make sense to me, that empathy has a lot of potential to kind of get OT back to its symbolic roots and kind of address this growing divide. I'd also realized that if I was going to tackle empathy as a potential solution, as a potential topic of research, I really needed to know what it was quite thoroughly and completely. Well, everybody probably has an idea what they think empathy is. When you really look at it, and you definitely need to look at the literature, it's very complex, it's very multifactorial, and it's very much evolving, especially in neuroscience, understanding the brain, how we respond to empathy. So it's very complex. I felt like I needed to make it complex, I needed to make it multifactorial. I couldn't simplify it down to like a simple, single definition. Didn't feel like that would be truthful or very accurate. So without spending a lot of time, I really broke it down into these 4 different parts. Theory of mind. Theory of mind is kind of the intellectualizing part of empathy. So without the feeling part. So you see somebody, you read their facial expressions, you read their body language, what they're saying, their particular context and circumstances, and you make you theorize. It's not really a theory, but you're kind of theorizing and guessing what you think they're thinking, what their perspective or mindset is. Emotional resonance is very much what most people think of empathy is the feeling of another. You feel their emotions, what they're experiencing. Emotional regulation, this is very important in healthcare. Rogers and others have shown this in their work. It's the idea of setting boundaries. So we're definitely want to understand the individual as best we can intellectually. You want to feel their emotions to a degree, but you want to keep a separation. It's them, not us. We're not merging our emotions. And then lastly, maybe most importantly, this idea of empathic volition, that empathy very much is a willful act. It's a kind of engagement process. It's empathy is something you do. It's not something you are. It's a verb, not a noun. I was just watching this documentary on a battle thing in World War II, and it was just these awful scenes in the battle. It was an island with the Japanese and all that. But what caught me is the soldiers doing these horrific things to each other. And then there was a break in the fighting, and there was these cats, little animals that were dying of thirst, and the soldiers were giving them water, picking them up, petting them, that sort of thing. The point is that empathy is kind of what you're doing. You're not doing empathy all the time. At the times you're engaging in empathy, at times you're not. Definitely, I'm sure people have traits of empathy, but to me it's very much the doing, a verb versus a kind of noun, kind of static kind of thing. If you look at this kind of graphic, it kind of gets at that this empathic process, this active engagement process involving all these different parts of empathy. This is kind of how I was thinking of empathy. It's this willful, complex, multifactorial process. So this is what empathy is. This is what I felt was empathy is, how I defined it. It's important. It may be a potential solution. How do I teach it? That was my challenge as an OT instructor, OT professor. How do I teach this to my students? I was looking at this idea of close reading, teaching empathy through close reading, and using literary narratives. So what do I mean by literary narratives? Literary narratives, in a simple sense, are just literature. If you think of a general ed class, introduction to literature, the Shakespeare, the Milton, that sort of stuff. But more in particular, it's really any kind of writing, could be fiction, could be nonfiction, memoir, that has these two really strong characteristics. The first is the language itself. The language is very sensory evoking, scene evoking, as Conrad said, to make you see. You can visualize this scene that's happening within this narrative. Secondly, maybe even most importantly, has complex characters, complex multifactorial characters that are usually flawed in some way. As Hemingway had said, three-dimensional characters, at least three-dimensional characters. They're not flat kind of things. They come to life in a sense, in a real sense. So complex characters, sensory evoking language. Close reading, what is close reading? It's kind of what it says, just closely attending to the text. You're closely attending to what's going on in the text, and you're doing a lot of reflection on that text. Reflection as in written reflection as in discussion, in-class discussion around the text, around the issues, around the characters, around the language, all that sort of stuff. So looking to the literature, I saw this emerging body of science, emerging connection between the reading of literary narratives and improved empathy levels. Individuals, participants that read literature pre and post had improved their empathy levels. What was also interesting, some of those studies, they kind of compared it, used controls around reading nonfiction or just fact-based material, and that seemed to drop empathy levels. And I thought this is potentially significant when we're teaching healthcare. What do we use in healthcare a lot is case studies. What are case studies? They're very fact-based, flat. They're not that three-dimensional character that we want that Hemingway talked about. So we're doing the opposite of what we want. We're making our healthcare students less empathetic by focusing so much on fact-based material. Demonstrated connection between the teaching of medical humanities and improved empathy levels. What are medical humanities? They come in all shapes and sizes, different forms, and a lot of healthcare programs, but basically they are art-focused, reading of literature, reading of poetry, studying paintings, performance art, and there seems to be a correlation between the art-based content and improved empathy levels in a healthcare kind of course setting. And then more systematically, at Columbia University, their medical school program, they started what they call a narrative medicine program. And that narrative medicine program is based on close reading of literary narratives, and it seems to be the most systematic way that I've found that somebody's doing this. A lot of places are just, like I said, they're just kind of all over the map, but this one seems to be more consistent. And it's spreading. They're doing it in Europe now. They're doing workshops throughout this country, and they're doing it for all kinds of healthcare providers, not just medical students. I went down and got some training at Columbia around this. So this seemed to be like a nice systematic way to get at close reading, a lot of reflection, discussion, and it emphasized this holistic, complete look of empathy that I kind of define in the literature around perspective taking, kind of embracing ambiguity. There is no one way, theory of mind, subjective experience. Traditionally in healthcare, we teach, especially in medical schools, they teach you to be objective and distant from the patient. This is teaching the opposite, to kind of feel those emotions, emotional resonance, critical reflection, again, understanding the distance, the perspective, reflective listening, this gets into communication theory, and then the patient's story, narrative reasoning again, this resonating thing with OT. So this seemed to make the most sense to me as a potential avenue, a way of kind of teaching empathy to the students.